Late evening, early 1944. A German headquarters somewhere behind the Western Front glows under dim yellow lamps. The room smells of cigarette smoke and damp wool coats. Boots are left by the door, snow melting slowly onto the floor. A situation map covers the main table. Colored pins mark divisions, supply routes, and thinning reserves. Officers lean in close, speaking quietly. Not from courtesy, but habit. One staff officer traces a finger across northern France. His movement slows and stops. A name is written beside a cluster of red arrows. Not a unit, not a location. Patton. The atmosphere changes almost imperceptibly. Chairs shift. Pens pause mid-note. This is not panic. It is recognition. Someone asks how far his lead elements advanced yesterday. The answer arrives quickly, and it is worse than expected. Another officer mentions Sicily. Someone else recalls Tunisia. No one raises their voice. There is no argument. They have seen this pattern before. When Patton appears, timelines collapse. Positions thought secure unravel before orders can adjust. Withdrawals become routes, not through weakness, but speed. The concern is not his tanks. It is not his numbers. It is the way time behaves around him. Compressed. Denied. A senior officer finally speaks, quietly. If he is here, we must act sooner. The map does not change. The pins stay where they are, but the fear is already active. And fear, once it enters planning, reshapes decisions long before the first shot. This is not yet the moment of realization, but it is the shadow leading toward it. Because in German command rooms, Patton is no longer a general. He is a problem. And problems like this rarely wait. By 1944, German command in the West was operating under constant pressure. The front stretched too far, reserves grew thinner, and every decision carried delay. Years of war had reshaped German expectations. Rapid victories were gone, replaced by managed retreats and defensive improvisation. Divisions were under strength. Fuel was rationed. Experienced officers were harder to replace than equipment. Commanders no longer planned for decisive maneuver. They planned to contain damage. The Western Front demanded constant adjustment. Each Allied advance forced German units to redeploy, often before rest or refit. This environment conditioned fear in a specific way. Not fear of defeat, but fear of collapse. German doctrine still valued order and sequence. Reconnaissance, deployment, preparation, then engagement. But that sequence was increasingly fragile. Disrupt one step, and the rest unraveled. Allied commanders were studied carefully. Patterns were identified, habits cataloged. Most were considered manageable, methodical, predictable. German staffs believed they could absorb pressure if they understood its rhythm. Time, they assumed, was still theirs to manage. But strain altered perception. Under pressure, speed became more dangerous than strength. A fast breakthrough did not just seize ground. It erased options. Commanders feared moments when reports arrived faster than decisions could be made, when orders described a battlefield that no longer existed. This strain formed the backdrop for everything that followed. It shaped how German intelligence evaluated threats. Not all enemies were equal. Some could be planned against. Others destabilized planning itself. By 1944, German command was no longer afraid of Allied numbers alone. It feared losing control of time, and that fear made certain names resonate more deeply than others. One name in particular would soon dominate those conversations. German commanders entered 1944 with a firm belief about how the Allies fought. That belief was built on observation, experience, and repeated confirmation. Allied operations, in German eyes, followed a familiar rhythm. Careful build-up, heavy preparation, methodical advance. British forces were seen as deliberate and cautious. They gathered strength, secured flanks, and moved only when conditions felt controlled. American forces, while energetic, appeared bound by procedure. They followed doctrine, respected logistics, and paused to reorganize. This predictability created confidence. If an enemy's rhythm was known, it could be disrupted. German staffs believed they could trade space for time, withdraw in order, reform defensive lines. The assumption was simple. Allied commanders would not outrun their supplies or risk disorder. This illusion shaped defensive planning. Positions were designed to absorb pressure, not withstand sudden exploitation. Counterattacks were timed for moments when Allied advances paused. Those pauses were expected, even relied upon. German commanders did not underestimate Allied strength. They underestimated Allied willingness to ignore the script. Patton did not fit this pattern. But early encounters were dismissed as exceptions. Tunisia was attributed to inexperience. Sicily was explained as overextension. German analysts preferred patterns over anomalies. They believed behavior would eventually conform. That belief delayed adaptation. It encouraged waiting for the familiar pause that never came. Predictability is comforting in war. It makes planning feel possible. But it also blinds commanders to threats that move outside expectation. By the time German staffs began questioning this illusion, it was already under pressure. And one commander, in particular, was applying that pressure relentlessly. The first cracks appeared long before France, and they were easy to explain away. They began in North Africa, where American forces were expected to learn slowly. After Kasserine Pass, German commanders believed they understood the Americans. Inexperienced, cautious, once bloodied. Then Patton arrived. Within weeks, German reports described a different opponent. American units moved sooner than expected, attacking before defenses fully settled. Timetables began to slip. Positions prepared for one day were engaged the day before. German after-action reports noted unusual pressure. Not overwhelming firepower, but relentless movement. Patton did not pause after contact. He pressed forward, forcing withdrawals to continue without rest. At the time, this was labeled aggressiveness, risk-taking, personal style. Sicily deepened the concern. German units tracking Allied landings expected a familiar rhythm. Instead, Patton's 7th Army advanced at speed. Routes thought secondary became main axes overnight. German defenses were bypassed rather than reduced. Rear areas became front lines without warning. Commanders reported losing situational clarity. Orders were issued for positions already outflanked. Still, these incidents were rationalized. Island terrain, limited space, unique conditions. German staffs preferred to believe the pattern would not repeat. They treated Patton as an exception, not a model. But exceptions accumulate, and patterns change when exceptions keep arriving. By the time Sicily ended, a quiet reassessment had begun. Some officers started circling Patton's name in reports, not as a curiosity, as a variable. The cracks were no longer theoretical. They were operational, and they were spreading, unnoticed by those still waiting for predictability to return. France, summer 1944, removed the remaining excuses. This was no longer confined terrain or isolated operations. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy, German commanders expected a familiar pause. A moment to reorganize, establish new lines, and regain control of movement. That pause never came. Patton's Third Army advanced with a tempo that defied German planning cycles. Units penetrated deep before defensive positions could be coordinated. German formations found themselves cut off rather than engaged. Supply routes vanished before orders to withdraw were received. After-action reports began to repeat the same language. Confusion, loss of contact, unclear enemy locations. This was escalation, not coincidence. Patton's presence correlated directly with breakdowns in German command rhythm. Where other Allied advances bent the front, Patton's shattered it. Not through superior numbers, but through denial of reaction time. German officers noted that resistance did not fail gradually. It failed abruptly. Positions collapsed not because they were weak, but because they were late. Late to deploy, late to fire, late to disengage. The fear deepened as patterns emerged. Where Patton appeared, planning horizons shortened dramatically. Defensive depth became meaningless when rear areas were already threatened. Reserves arrived only to discover they had nowhere coherent to assemble. German intelligence began flagging Patton's movements separately, not as routine reporting, but as priority warnings. This was the escalation point, the shift from concern to anxiety. Patton was no longer an aggressive commander among many. He was becoming a force that altered the entire operational environment. German command was beginning to understand the danger. But understanding was still incomplete. The realization had not yet fully crystallized. That moment was still ahead. By late summer 1944, German command no longer relied on impressions alone. The concerns surrounding Patton began to harden into documented assessment. Intercepted orders from field units told a consistent story. Where Patton's formations appeared, timelines compressed beyond control. After-action reports arriving from France showed abnormal patterns. Defensive lines were not tested. They were bypassed. German staff officers compared casualty figures across sectors. Losses were not always higher, but collapses were faster. Prisoner interrogations added an unexpected dimension. German soldiers repeatedly described the same experience. They spoke of never knowing where Patton's forces were, of attacks coming from directions not anticipated. Units reported receiving withdrawal orders too late to execute them. Movements begun at night were overtaken by morning. Rail and road movement data reinforced the fear. Formations redeployed to block Patton often arrived after the breakthrough had already passed. What unsettled German planners most was the consistency. This was not luck. It was systemic. Analysts concluded that Patton was disrupting the German decision cycle itself. Reconnaissance, assessment, and response no longer aligned in time. The problem was not his strength. It was his refusal to pause. German command began circulating internal warnings. Patton's presence required earlier reaction than doctrine allowed. This marked the shift from anecdote to conviction. Fear was no longer emotional. It was analytical. The data had spoken clearly. One Allied commander repeatedly erased the margin for adjustment. And once that conclusion was accepted, everything that followed would be shaped by it. Because the danger was no longer hypothetical. It had a name. The realization did not arrive with drama. It emerged slowly, then all at once. In late 1944, German senior staffs began comparing assessments across theaters. North Africa, Sicily, France. The same pattern appeared every time Patton was involved. Not heavier losses, not stronger forces, faster collapse. German planners reached a quiet conclusion. Patton was not simply aggressive. He was structurally dangerous. His tempo attacked the German command system itself. Orders arrived late because situations changed faster than reporting cycles allowed. Defensive doctrine depended on timing. Patton removed time. For the first time, German generals stopped asking where Patton's tanks were. They asked where he might be tomorrow. This was the moment the fear crystallized. Patton was no longer treated as a battlefield opponent. He became a strategic variable. From that point forward, his presence alone altered German decisions. Reserves were held back. Defensive plans were accelerated prematurely. German commanders understood something fundamental had shifted. Patton did not defeat units. He defeated decision-making. This realization was deeply unsettling. Doctrine offered no answer. Speed could not be countered by strength alone. Unpredictability could not be planned away. The fear was not irrational. It was analytical, grounded in experience and data. And once accepted, it could not be ignored. From this moment on, Patton's shadow would shape German planning even in his absence. The war had acquired a psychological front, and Patton dominated it. Once the realization settled, German behavior began to change almost immediately. The shift was subtle at first, then unmistakable. Units were redeployed based on Patton's location rather than confirmed threats. Reports mentioning his movements were marked urgent, regardless of scale. Reserves were shifted earlier than planned, sometimes too early. German commanders began reinforcing sectors Patton might reach, even when other fronts were under direct pressure. This created gaps elsewhere. Quiet sectors became thin. Critical moments were misjudged. Defensive preparations accelerated prematurely. Positions were occupied before they were ready to fight. In some cases, units dug in where Patton never arrived. In others, they abandoned ground too quickly, fearing encirclement that never came. The aftershock spread through command channels. Staff officers learned that mentioning Patton changed conversations. Meetings shortened. Timelines were revised downward. Fear did not paralyze German command. It distorted it. Decisions were made faster, but with less information. Flexibility gave way to anticipation driven by anxiety. Ironically, this reaction amplified Patton's effect. By acting on fear alone, German planners undermined their own coherence. The front became uneven. Some sectors were over-defended, others dangerously exposed. Patton did not need to exploit every mistake. The system was now destabilizing itself. The fear that followed his name created movement where none was required, and hesitation where action was needed. This was the aftershock of realization, not panic, but misalignment. German command had accepted Patton as uniquely dangerous. Now they were learning the cost of believing it. But the deeper reasons for this fear still demanded explanation. The fear Patton inspired was not emotional. It was rooted in structure, rhythm, and timing. German command doctrine relied on orderly decision cycles. Information moved up. Orders moved down. Action followed in sequence. This system functioned under pressure only if time existed between stages. Patton removed that time. His tempo forced German units to react before understanding. Reconnaissance became outdated the moment it was completed. Patton advanced in ways that refused closure. He did not pause to secure every position. He moved past resistance and let it collapse behind him. German doctrine expected pauses, moments to reorganize, reposition artillery, and prepare counterattacks. Those pauses never came. Patton's insistence on continuous movement shattered predictability. Rear areas became front lines without warning. German commanders were trained to manage risk through control. Patton denied control by accelerating uncertainty. Even when German units fought well, they fought late. Late to block routes, late to withdraw cleanly. This created a psychological feedback loop. The faster Patton moved, the more German command hesitated. Hesitation worsened delays. Delays magnified collapse. Patton did not need to deceive. He simply acted faster than the system could absorb. His refusal to pause created fear because it removed options. And in war, options are survival. This is why German command feared Patton more than numbers, more than air power, more than material. He attacked the space between decisions, the fragile interval where armies still believe they can recover. Once that space vanished, strength mattered less. Only timing remained, and Patton owned it. The consequences of that imbalance were already unfolding. The effects of this fear were felt directly on the battlefield. German defensive efforts became reactive rather than deliberate. Positions were reinforced too early or too late. Some strong points were abandoned before contact. Others held past the moment of usefulness. Encirclements increased not because German units were weak, but because they hesitated to move until Patton's direction was certain. By the time certainty arrived, it was already obsolete. Routes of withdrawal closed quickly. German reserves lost their purpose as a stabilizing force. They arrived to situations already decided. Opportunities to counterattack existed briefly. They vanished while orders moved through the chain. Entire formations were lost not in decisive battles, but in fragmented retreats and partial withdrawals. The fear of Patton created misallocation. Critical sectors went underdefended while attention fixed elsewhere. This imbalance compounded across the front. A system already strained became brittle. German commanders later described the sensation as chasing shadows. They prepared for Patton's arrival while responding to his absence. Allied forces exploited the results without always understanding the cause. Gaps appeared. Resistance collapsed unexpectedly. Patton did not need to strike everywhere. The fear of where he might strike was enough. The immediate consequence was not panic. It was distortion. German command lost the ability to prioritize effectively. And once that ability faded, collapse followed in increments. The front did not fall in one moment. It unraveled. And that unraveling traced back to a single conclusion German commanders could not escape. Patton changed the way they made decisions. And decision-making, once compromised, is difficult to repair. Over time, Patton's name became more than a tactical concern. It hardened into a fixation within German strategic thinking. German planners began to allocate forces based on Patton's potential movements, not on confirmed Allied intentions. This distorted long-term planning. Reserves were held back longer than necessary, waiting for Patton to appear. Entire defensive concepts were shaped around containing him. Other Allied commanders benefited from the space this created. German intelligence increasingly interpreted events through a Patton-focused lens. When fronts collapsed elsewhere, explanations often returned to his influence. This fixation reduced adaptability. German command became reactive to perception rather than reality. The fear persisted even when Patton was not present. His absence did not ease anxiety. Instead, it created uncertainty. If Patton was unseen, he was assumed to be maneuvering. Allied deception efforts later exploited this dynamic deliberately. Patton's reputation became a strategic tool, not just a byproduct of success. German leadership expended mental energy countering a threat that was not always real. That energy could not be recovered. In the final months of the war, German commanders faced pressure on every front. Yet Patton remained the name most associated with sudden collapse. This long-term psychological impact outlived individual campaigns. It reshaped how German officers evaluated Allied intent. Even after defeats, the fear did not fully disappear. It lingered as explanation, justification, and regret. Patton's greatest effect was not measured in territory alone. It was measured in altered behavior. He forced an enemy to fight the war they feared, not the war they planned. And that shift endured until the end. In war, fear is often treated as weakness, something to be hidden, denied, or overcome. For German command in 1944, fear became information. It signaled where systems failed, where time disappeared, where control slipped. Patton did not manufacture this fear deliberately at first. He earned it through repetition. Every time he appeared, fronts moved faster than expected. Plans unraveled before they could be corrected. Over time, German commanders stopped asking whether he was dangerous. They asked how much damage his presence would cause before they could react. That question haunted maps and meetings alike. Even in silence, his name accelerated decisions. Patton understood something many never articulated. War is not only about strength or numbers. It is about forcing the enemy to think too fast, to decide before understanding. Fear, in that sense, was not irrational. It was the correct response to a threat that operated faster than doctrine allowed. By the end of the war, Patton's reputation had become a weapon in its own right. It shaped deployments, distorted priorities, and consumed attention. The irony is simple. Patton defeated German command long before his tanks arrived. Not by terror, by tempo. The moment German generals understood this, the war gained a psychological front they could never stabilize. Fear did not break them immediately. It bent them, repeatedly, until the structure failed. In the end, Patton did not need to be everywhere. He only needed to be believed. And in that belief, German command lost something irreplaceable: time. Because once fear dictates decisions, the enemy no longer needs to strike first. They are already moving ahead of you.